Welcome to Still Unbelievable, a podcast by Reason Press, where we examine religious claims, especially those made by Christians, and we regularly respond to items that are featured on the podcast Unbelievable. We embrace dialogue, but as sceptical former believers, we will also criticise unfounded claims and unsupported beliefs. Hello and welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. The regular guys at the helm, Andrew and Matthew here, and we've got a guest with us, another Professor Andrew Halestrap. You may remember that name from a recent episode of Still Unbelievable where he had a chat with friend of the show, Sam. So that is how I got in touch with Andrew. Andrew is a former chairman of Christians in Science, Emeritus Professor of Biochemistry at the University of Bristol, which, for those who've paid attention to episodes of Still Unbelievable, is actually local to me. Welcome on to the show, Andrew. I'm really pleased and really glad to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, thank you. And so I got in touch with you following the conversation that you had on Still Unbelievable, and I was really interested in your involvement with Christians in Science. And that, if I remember right, not a huge amount was said about that on Still Unbelievable. So I'd like to hear more as a personal interest as much as anything else, a bit about Christians in Science. So tell us about yourself, how you got involved with Christians in Science, what Christians in Science stands for, how people can contact them, and the work that the organisation does.
Right. Well, I think I'll start with what Christians in Science is. We're an international and cross-denominational network of those concerned with the relationship between science and the Christian faith. It actually started life as the Research Scientist Christian Fellowship, aiming to very much support and encourage research scientists who are Christians. But over the years, we've moved into a rather broader remit of what we do. It might be easiest if I actually read our aims. So the first aim is to develop and promote biblical Christian views on the nature and scope of science and its interaction with the Christian faith, bringing a biblical Christian perspective on scientific issues into the public arena. And then the second aim is to encourage Christians who are engaged in scientific work to maintain an active faith, apply it to their professional lives, and share it within the scientific community. And then thirdly, we want to support churches by helping congregations appreciate the harmony of science and faith and assist them with their outreach activities. And fourthly, to help Christian Science students to integrate their religious beliefs with their studies and to support them as they graduate and progress in their careers. And then finally, and very relevant at the moment, to stimulate responsible Christian attitudes and action towards care for the environment. So that's what the organization is. I'm both a Christian and a scientist, so it was very natural for me to get involved from square one. So when I finished as an undergraduate and became a research student, I'll come on to that in a moment, I joined the organization. And it was very much, I was a passenger to some extent. I read the journal that they produce, and I knew a few people who were members. But it was one of those, I would call it divine coincidences. I got to a point in my career when I'd finished a couple of quite big jobs. I chaired the British Heart Foundation Research Projects Committee. I'd been chairman of the Bristol Heart Institute. And those things were coming to an end. And I was just beginning to think about moving churches. And I thought, I wonder what I should be doing next. And I was on the train up to London for a meeting. And my email went ping. And it was the present chairman, well, he was the chairman then of Christians in Science, saying, would I consider being chairman of Christians in Science? And that's what I thought might be God's call. So I gave it some more thought and agreed. So for 6 years, until just over a year ago, I chaired the organization, which was been a very exciting episode in my life. And in fact, one of my main emphases was to encourage work amongst students. And we got a £500,000 grant out of the Templeton Foundation to work amongst students. We produce loads of resources. We provide speakers for people who want to address science, faith issues. But the best place to find out about us really is to go onto the website, which is cis.org.uk. And there's lots of information there, including where there are local groups, like we have a local group in Bristol, which allows us to continue to have local lectures and meet up with fellow scientists, people who are interested in science and faith locally. So that's a sort of potted history of Christians in science. I don't know if you've got any questions on that before I talk a bit about my own journey as a Christian and as a scientist.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. How old is the organisation?
We started in the late 40s. I think I'm right in saying that. It was after the war. The person who started it actually was a research scientist who later became the secretary of the what used to be called the InterVarsity Fellowship and then became the University and Colleges Christian Fellowship. And he was a very, very bright zoologist. And he recognized that a lot of research scientists, needed support, but also had a lot of contributions he felt to make to the sort of science-faith debate. So initially it was a very small organization, and it's grown over the years. It was originally under UCCF, but we became independent, must be about 10 or 15 years ago.
I can see that it's a UK-based organisation, or I'm assuming that from the URL which you just gave out, which incidentally listeners will be in the show notes of this show. So if you didn't catch it, just pop into the show notes and this will be there. So it starts off as a UK organisation, but you did say that it's an international. So when did that switch come in, and what's your involvement with, and how does that international involvement work?
Well, there's two levels. I mean, as you know, in science, people move around the world. So some people who were working in the UK have gone back to other countries and have maintained their contacts. Other countries don't have much to support Christians in science themselves, so they will join. We have a journal which a lot of people like called Science and Christian Belief. It's quite a high-powered science faith journal. And so some people from other countries join just so they can get the journal. But there are offshoots of Christians in science in quite a few other countries now, and they're all listed on our website. America has its own equivalent. It's ASA, which is the American Science Affiliation. And so we work very closely with them, and we're planning a joint conference with them in a couple of years' time. Canada has an equivalent group. So there are a lot of groups that are in a sort of loose network.
The curious listener who might be listening, who might even have a faith, I genuinely don't know how many Christians listen to this podcast habitually. So if you're a Christian who regularly listens, please drop me a line. Let me know that you are listening. It'll be really genuinely interesting to hear that. So for the Christian that is listening, who is a little bit unsure about their scientific credentials, what scientific credentials do you need to join the organisation?
Oh, none at all. The interest in science is important. Right. Because obviously we support mainstream science, so we're not creationists or anything like that, and we basically accept mainstream science, and we also accept a conservative view of the Bible, but we don't see any conflict, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. There is a statement of faith that is available on the website which shows what we believe, and to become a full member, you have to agree to that, but you can become an associate member and still have all our access to all our resources, but you can't vote at any of our meetings.
Right, I understand. But if somebody is curious, sorry, carry on.
We have teachers. We have people who are just generally interested. We have research scientists. We have industrialists. We have engineers. So it's a very broad remit. I think at the moment we've got about 700 full members in the UK. Okay, but then the local groups, I mean, our local group in Bristol have got 500 people on the mailing list, so they're not members, but they come to our local lectures and things.
Excellent. So they have it, listeners. If you're curious about science, go on to the website to take a look and see if there's anything that sparks you. Now, you did say that you do a lot of support for students, and you also just mentioned teachers as well. So are there resources for school teachers as well, for the school teacher that wants to teach a science curriculum?
We actually are just looking at developing our work with teachers more, but there are plenty of other organisations that do a lot more with schools. So, for example, there's the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in Cambridge, which has a whole schools section. And we've had them to Bristol, and they're absolutely wonderful because they're scientists, proper scientists, who do experiments with the kids and then talk a bit about the relationship between science and faith. And they will help teachers in developing RE curricula around the science-faith interface, which of course schools have to do. So, and we will provide people to go into schools to talk. There's another organisation called God and the Big Bang, which comes out of Manchester, and they do whole days with schools and bring in quite a few young Christian scientists who talk about their experiments, and then you have a plenary talk by someone like myself. Really, and the kids are really excited. It's normally for GCSE and upwards. And just to give you an example of this, we might go into a school with, say, 100 or 200 kids, and we do a questionnaire at the beginning, and we ask them a variety of questions, including, do they think science and faith are compatible? And roughly speaking, 80% of the students, before we talk and present, say, no, they're not compatible. By the end, they're really excited, very positive feedback, and they realize that actually they are compatible. That's not saying they're going to believe, but they suddenly realize the conflict that they thought existed is not really a real conflict.
Okay. And on the subject of that then, do you have any breakdown of the reasons why they would say that there's a conflict?
To be honest, I work with God and the Big Bang. You could go onto their website and have a look, but more often than not, it is because of the pervading media, which tends to promote still this conflict model of science and faith. So that, if you like, the high priests of atheism, be it Richard Dawkins or some of the others that are well known, the astronomer guy, whose name escapes me.
Are you talking about
Brian
Lawrence
Cox?
Krauss?
Yeah, Brian Cox, thanks. That's what I was looking for. People like that get a very high profile on the media, and that does, I think, have a huge influence on kids. They've never really been presented with real live scientists who are Christians presenting the case that faith and science are compatible. And when they hear it, they're quite interested, to say the least. That's what students do when I go to student events. And recently I was doing a series of lectures in Ireland on science as a Christian vocation. And they got in quite a reasonable number. And a lecturer in genetics came in out of interest, who wasn't a Christian. And he came up to me afterwards and said, I've never really seen it this way before. I must go away and do some more thinking. And I think it's just people have never really been presented with this, well, I say never, but I think the emphasis has been wrong. There's been this conflict model rather than hearing a proper scientist talking about how they see science and faith.
Thank you. Andrew, was there a question you wanted to throw in?
Because it seems that, for the listeners, yes, I'm babysitting and I'm podcasting from the park today, and my apologies. I think the question that I would ask about the conflict model is, to what extent do you think those who are promoting the conflict model are doing it for some reason other than the fact that they see a legitimate conflict? Do you think that there's some other motivation here other than, yes, we actually see a conflict between faith and science? Is there some darker motive, if you will?
I couldn't speak for all of the scientists. I think, to be honest, my experience as a scientist and talking to a lot of other pretty high-powered scientists is that they have never actually heard the other side of the argument. We could get onto this whole thing about why scientists don't like to believe in God, and I would quite like to do that, whether now's the time to do it. But in terms of Occam's razor, why should I believe in a God? It's not the simplest hypothesis. And they haven't really, I think, thought through that. So certainly people like Dawkins, that would be a very strong argument that God is an unnecessary extra. They see that as a real problem, I'm sure. I don't think it is a real problem myself. I don't think there are people out there intentionally being evil to try and mislead people. I wouldn't say that at all. there may be an element in all of us of an arrogance that we don't like there to be something greater that we don't understand. I think that may be true of all of us to some extent. But no, I wouldn't see people as having a hidden agenda. I think they honestly believe in their gospel of science.
Thank you for that. That fully answers the question, and I think we'll get into some possible follow-on questions. But Matthew, I'll give it back to you and let you decide where to go.
Andrew, I'd like to hear about the science that you've done and the background in science that you've got. I know we talked about that a little bit offline with my Andrew here, and he got quite excited about that. So tell us about the science that you've done.
Yeah, well, I should say that science has been in my blood from the very earliest age that I can really remember. I've always been interested in discovering how things work. I was always more interested in non-fiction books than fiction books. I had a chemistry set from the age of about 10, which was a pretty impressive one because my father, being a dentist, could get hold of chemicals that most people couldn't. And I
Awesome.
I used to make my own fireworks and did some pretty scary things in our cellar at home. So yeah, it was always something that was in my blood to find out how things worked. I then had a fantastic school education with some superb scientists. One was a PhD biochemist who taught me. So it perhaps wasn't surprising that I then went on to Cambridge to study natural sciences. Fairly early on, I knew I was going to be involved in research. So at the end of my undergraduate studies at Cambridge, where I specialised in biochemistry, I came to Bristol to do a PhD on the fascinating topic of the regulation of fat synthesis in the epididymal fat pads. Now, the fat pads is just fat, and it's around the epididymis of a rat that we were working on. And you have two epididymi meaning the didymus is the twin, and epi is around, and the epididymis is around the testicles. So two testicles, twins, epididymis. And these two fat pads are right alongside the epididymis. And that gives you the very exciting possibility of doing control and experimental conditions on what we call a matched pair, because they come from the same animal, and that's very much better for statistics. So I was looking at how insulin regulates the production or the biosynthesis of fats, which was a fascinating topic, and I got some very highly cited papers out of that, discovering a new mechanism for regulation. But whilst I was doing that, I was working with Pfizer, the drug company, who were working on anti-obesity agents, big money market, and they were very keen to get in there. Whilst I was working with them, I made a discovery which was one of those serendipitous discoveries where an experiment didn't give the expected results. And the one way of looking at that is I must have made a mistake. The other way to look at it is that's interesting, it may be telling me something. And they say chance favors the prepared mind. Unfortunately, my mind was sufficiently prepared to do some more experiments, and I made a discovery about how lactic acid gets in and out of cells. And lactic acid, we all know, is the stuff that builds up in your muscle when you exercise and gives you fatigue. So I was able to discover that there was a very specific mechanism for lactic acid to get in and out of cells. And what is more, that the inhibitor that I discovered that blocks that also blocked a very important metabolic process in mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell, the things that generate useful energy to make your heart beat, to make your muscles contract, all those sort of things. And that got me interested in mitochondria. So I then had two platforms to develop my research. One was the mitochondria, and the other was lactic acid. Well, life, you never know where it's going to go. It's like opening Pandora's box in research, and I kept answering one question and finding several other questions. But the path of my research led me into how you regulate the production of glucose in the liver, and that's very important in diabetes. And I was able to discover that the mitochondria plays a very important role, and that the most widely used anti-diabetic drug, metformin, which is used by millions of people, probably hundreds of millions of people worldwide, how it works to prevent too much glucose production. So that was, in fact, my most cited paper, and it was, again, a bit of a serendipitous discovery. But my mitochondrial research then led me in a slightly different direction into the heart, where it turns out that when you have a heart attack, the blood supply to the heart gets cut off. You have your coronary artery, which gets blocked with a blood clot. And that causes damage downstream of where the blood clot is. And if you don't treat it, then that will kill that part of the heart and may well kill you. So what happens is you're rushed into a hospital, and they put a sort of little fiber thing up through your artery, and it goes all the way probably from your arm or your groin right up into your coronary artery, and that displaces the clots and allows the blood to flow again and restores the activity of that downstream part of the heart. The problem is that as you restore the blood flow, you get yet more damage to the heart if you're not careful. And it turns out that the mitochondria are causing the damage. It's a bit like Jekyll and Hyde. Dr. Jekyll is the kind doctor, that's the healthy function of the heart, but Mr. Hyde is the murderer. And after a heart attack, when you restore the flow, the mitochondria become the Mr. Hyde and kill the heart. And we were able to work out what the mechanism was and develop drugs and protocols that provided some degree of protection. And that's also important in heart surgery, because you have to stop the blood flow in heart surgery. So that was almost all my research, but the lactic acid also took off, because lactic acid, not only is it important in your muscle, and we did a lot of work with exercise physiologists, because if you're an Olympic rower or runner, you upregulate lactic acid getting out of your muscle, which is not surprising. But we got into cancer because we were working with AstraZeneca, the drug company, and they developed a compound which turns out to inhibit lactic acid getting out of cells. And you might think, well, that's not very useful, is it? But it is, because cancer cells produce buckets of lactic acid. And if you can stop lactic acid getting out of cancer cells, they pickle themselves in lactic acid and stop growing and probably die. And who cares if you can't run a marathon if you're curing cancer? So,
Quite.
So that I got very much involved with that, and although they're not, I think, going to be standalone cancer drugs, they've been a very exciting development and will certainly reduce tumor growth, and probably in combination with other drugs could be quite an interesting therapy. So that's a bit of my scientific background, which has taken me in many directions, but all very exciting.
Genuinely exciting. I really enjoyed listening to that. So you carry on, Andrew.
Oh, I was just going to say, as a patient who has been subscribed metformin, I thank you for the work you do. And I'm also a long-distance runner, or at least I was some years ago. I still run somewhere between 4 and 6 miles a day. So I appreciate the contribution to exercise physiology and to the work regarding diabetes. So thank you on both fronts.
And you know all about lactic acid.
Oh boy. You know how I know about lactic acid the most is we all go through those occasions where we have to trim back the exercise for some reason, right?
Yeah.
And I have a tendency to do that whole weekend warrior thing. Well, I was able to run 26 miles 6 months ago, and I'm running 6 or 8 right now. Surely I can go out and do 20. And the lactic acid informs me for the next 2 or 3 days. That's a really bad idea. But I don't seem to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know if either of you go fishing, but the idea of playing a fish until it just stops doing any attempt to escape. It just flops to the surface, and you pull it into your net. And that's because the lactic acid builds up. So they don't use anything other than production of lactic acid to drive their muscle. And so they just get very, very tired and get into the net. But if you go game fishing, which is like tuna fish, they don't use the production of lactic acid. They burn all their glucose to CO2 and water. That's why it's called red muscle, because it's got lots of mitochondria. They take a lot of tiring out to tuna.
Right, yeah. Interesting biology lesson there, yeah.
Oh, it is. Is is there something that, boy, we're way off track here, but I've got to ask because there will be people who love running or cycling or swimming or whatever that are listening to the show. Is there something simple that that athletes and aspiring athletes can do to consume more lactic acid during the exercise process, like a tuna, for instance? Is there something simple there, or are we as humans biologically so different that we just have to build up exercise very slowly so that we don't incur that lactic acid penalty?
Well, it's actually muscle physiology is very complicated, and you will have heard of red and white muscle. White muscle is the stuff like in a chicken breast, and it doesn't have mitochondria, and it's all lactic acid. Whereas red muscle is the one you tend to use for endurance exercise, and that doesn't produce very much lactic acid. It actually burns it. Your heart also burns the lactic acid that's produced by a white muscle. So it's quite a complicated business. And if you're going to be a good endurance runner, then you don't produce very much lactic acid because you try and keep aerobic all the time and burn fuel to CO2 and oxygen. And the small amount of lactic acid you do produce is burnt by the rest of the muscle. But if you're a sprinter, it's nearly all lactic acid, and you go into, after you've sprinted, you go into oxygen debt, we call it, because you then have to get rid of all your lactic acid. So that's why you can't go on sprinting forever, because the lactic acid builds up to a high point. Mm. Anyway, we've got a bit off the subject.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but it's interesting nevertheless, though.
We do another show called Proscenium. I'd love to have you over on Proscenium just to talk about exercise physiology, because...
Well, you wouldn't, because I'm not an exercise physiologist. I'm a biochemist. I know about it only because I've done a bit of research on it. But no, you'd want a proper exercise physiologist.
Fair enough. Sorry, Matthew. Take this back and put us back on the rails.
Well, the other question I wanted to ask, there were two questions that came out to mind. One is the frivolous one, which was, is it theoretically possible then that there could be a drug that literally stops the lactic acid payoff? I'm going to assume you're going to say no to that, but that was one area where my mind went on that.
Well, you couldn't exist if you totally blocked lactic acid everywhere all the time.
Right, okay. So
what you're looking for with drugs is ones that can be selective. Life's pretty complicated when we get into that area, but there is no panacea drug.
Yeah, I pretty much imagined that the payoff cost is probably more than it's worth. But the other question, though, when you were talking about the potential impact on cancer and stopping or certainly reducing spread of cancer, as someone who's had a family member suffer with breast cancer, and the breast cancer eventually ended up in the lymph nodes, which is probably quite a common thing. So is the mechanism that you're talking about something that would either stop or reduce the chances of the cancer spreading into the lymph nodes, and then obviously you've got a much worse diagnosis after that?
Again, I want to say I'm not a cancer specialist. We are involved in this work simply because we discovered and have been the sort of world leaders in lactic acid transport, not in cancer. The drug company AstraZeneca that's been doing this, and other drug companies are trying to find drugs, they, I think, have been disappointed, as have many drug therapies for cancer been more disappointing than we expect, because cancer cells find ways around almost everything you throw at them. The blood cancers that the cancers I think these drugs have been most successful with is blood cancers. And even there, I don't think they are probably going to make it onto the market. I was talking to a physician in Newcastle who's really disappointed because there are a few patients that have really benefited. But it's got to be pretty good to make a profit, and it's not that good.
Yeah, that's a shame. I've had two family members die in the last decade and a half from different cancers, and yes, cancers are different. We all badge them with the same label, cancer, but we need to acknowledge that they're very, very different diseases, and they all require different treatments, and they have different effects, and different people will respond differently to them. It's a massively complex area, but thank you for the work that you do, and the people that do work in cancer treatment. They do a sterling job, and it must be a shame when something that's promising shows some signs, and then you realise that actually nature is too clever for us sometimes.
Well, yeah. When I first discovered this mechanism back in 1975, I think it was, my my parents came to visit just when I was getting my PhD. And my mother said to me, well, have you discovered a cure for cancer? And I suddenly realized that if we get one of these inhibitors that were really specific, it should have an effect on cancer. So I was really excited when this inhibitor came along and we were able to work on it. And we now, actually, the structure of the protein with it bound has just very recently been published, so it's really exciting. But unfortunately, life is never that simple.
Yeah, that's a shame. It's always it's a long battle, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
On the subject of that and how we map science to Christianity and some of the conversation that we can have around that, for some of our listeners, and that would include me on occasions as well, would consider themselves to be strong evidentialists. So in terms of what you've been talking about, in terms of the drugs you've been using and the tests you've been doing, those all fit to what is a common understanding of the scientific method.
Yeah.
And then when people want to challenge faith and religion, and we're talking specifically Christianity, but it doesn't have to be specifically Christianity, they want to see a similar standard met in terms of, even if it's not absolute evidential proof, at least some kind of process that they can try to replicate to try to get an indication of God. Does that work in a scientific environment? And what are our listeners and myself occasionally misunderstanding about where the role of a Godhead fits into when we look at science?
That's a very good question. You know, I'm not a great one for history of science. My knowledge is limited. But one of the key changes in science occurred in the sort of 16th, 17th century, was associated with the Enlightenment and then the Reformation. And up to that time, a lot of science, it was called natural philosophy, really, and you tended to think about how things worked. But the big change became when people started doing experimental science. So they were setting up a hypothesis and then testing it. So you make observations, you think, what might explain this? Can I do an experiment to test it? You do the experiment to test it. If the hypothesis holds up, then it's more likely to be correct. If the hypothesis doesn't hold up to the test, you know you've got the wrong hypothesis. And interestingly, a lot of the early scientists, particularly the astronomers and physicists like Newton, astronomers like Galileo, they really saw their scientific endeavors as an outworking of their belief in a creator God who had created an ordered universe that we could both understand and that pointed to him as the creator. And one of the things that, one of the sort of Psalms in the Bible that they liked is Psalm 19, which says, Psalm 111, I think, great are the works of the Lord, they are pondered by all who delight in him. And they actually felt that as they were studying science, they were understanding the hand of a creator. God was ultimately responsible for all that was happening, but they were understanding how he worked. Or as one astronomer, Kepler, put it, we are thinking God's thoughts after him. So what they felt was that God had made a world that was consistent, obeyed laws. We all have faith in laws, whether we're atheists or Christians. But the Christian believes those laws are God-given, and they're God-given such that we can study and make sense of the world that God has made, and therefore use our information for the benefit of humankind. So as we develop science, we now do it very much in terms of hypothesis, experiment, look at the results, does it support the hypothesis, and move on. Now that is something that you can do in experimental science, but when it comes to the evidence for God, it's slightly more difficult to do the experiment. So what you're looking at there is reasons for the belief in God. Are the reasons for the belief in God better than the reasons against a belief in God? And we both would admit, whether we be believers or non-believers, that we can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God. There is no fundamental experiment that anybody can do, as far as I'm aware, to make 100% proof. Only if God suddenly comes back and convinces him us in a way that we can't deny, could we say we proved it. And we haven't seen that yet, although we might come on to Jesus and who he was in a moment. But so I think what I do is I look at what are the reasons for believing in God, and do I regard them as greater than the reasons for not believing in God. But at the end of the day, I will be the first to admit that I cannot prove his existence. But then there's a lot of things we can't prove, and yet we accept to be true, like our own existence. And I love the saying by the Chinese sage who said once that, how can I be sure that I am man dreaming that I am a butterfly, and not when I awake a butterfly dreaming that I am a man? Both are logical positions, but one we regard as self-evidently more likely than the other. So that's the sort of way I try and weigh up the evidence that I can't do the experiment to test the hypothesis. Does that sort of vaguely get at what you're saying, or what you're asking?
Yes, it does. Thanks, Andrew.
Oh, I was just going to ask. So Matthew and I, to put a preamble on this, Matthew and I were both Christians in the past, and sort of worked our way out of it for quite similar reasons. I won't bore you with all of that. One of the reasons that I think is important to this conversation, because it appeals to the sort of experimentation that you were talking about, is first, I agree that there doesn't seem to be an experiment that we can do to demonstrate that God doesn't exist, right? It's not like we can combine two elements or use electrolysis or anything like that, right? We can't, there's no empirical sort of experiment we can do, apparently. But there does seem to be a logical test. And this is one of the things that caused me to conclude that it was less likely than not that there was a God. And that is that I feel like there are some logical contradictions in the views of God that I have seen thus far. And so I think I'm sort of, I'm sort of in the place where I would say, well, there may be a God, but the ones that I've been introduced to are of such a contradictory nature that I don't think those can be it.
So are you going to sort of expand a bit on what the contradictions are that have led you to that conclusion?
The predominant view, for instance, that there's a God that maintains an eternal torture chamber is so contradictory in regard to an all-loving God that I don't think that God can actually exist.
Well, I would agree with you, and I don't think myself that is the God that the Bible presents. I think that is the God that some people have interpreted the Bible as saying, but personally, yeah, I would agree that, I mean, there is a problem in terms of if there is such a thing as an almighty God, and there is such a thing as evil, then evil cannot exist in the presence of God. So I would be quite, but the idea of an eternal torture chamber, I don't think, I personally see that if a person chooses to reject God, God is not going to force him into his presence. He just lets him snuff out. But that's, so I would agree with you on that one. I would find that a very difficult. If I was forced to believe that, I don't know whether I could maintain my faith.
So there are other, if you want to keep going on this line, I'm happy to, but I don't want, I understand your position. I'm not trying to suggest through my lack of belief that you have somehow done something irrational, right? So, but I'm happy to keep going if you want to.
Well, I mean, the other way of doing this is I can give you sort of the reasons why I've come to the conclusion that the existence of God is a better explanation for the world we have than his absence. we are looking, when it comes to science, at the level of the how, and that to some extent my faith is telling me the why. And so all I'm doing when I am as a scientist is understanding how God works. But when I'm talking more in faith terms, I'm talking more about the why. And I guess the first thing that I tend to think of when I ask myself the question why, and yes, how is part of it, is we do live in this incredibly improbable universe. And even if you're an atheist and a cosmologist, which some are and some aren't, you recognize the improbability of the universe, the fine-tuning, the incredible balance of forces, the initial conditions having to be so precise to contain a stable universe. And so there are a variety of explanations for that. One, of course, is that God is responsible for the fine-tuning. The other is that it just happened. It may well be that there are billions of universes, the multiverse theory, and of course we're in the one that worked, the one where the conditions were just right, the one where we are in a particular solar system with a planet just the right distance from the sun for conditions to be right for life to, first of all, be initiated by some process and then evolve into the complex life forms that we have. So it is perfectly possible for that to occur purely by chance, but it is extremely fine-tuned and extremely improbable. So if you were to compare the probabilities of this universe with the national lottery would be a doddle. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen, because there could have been multiverses. So that's one reason I like to think of it. Then I move on from there to think in terms of, well, why should God be a more likely hypothesis than a multiverse? Just it all came about by chance. And here I do come back to Occam's razor, because Occam's razor is often used, atheists, to argue against God, because they would say that Occam's razor says the simplest hypothesis to fit the facts is the best one. And that is how we operate in science. If we have a simpler hypothesis that explains everything, it's a better hypothesis. And in mathematics, this is often the case, that the very profound equations are quite simple. E equals mc squared, being an example. I mean, of course, there are extremely complex ones as well. But the simplest hypothesis is that explains the facts is the best. So my atheist friends would say, well, okay, if you introduce God, this is an extra complexity which we don't need. Now, at one level, that's a very convincing argument. But many of these scientists also admit to the improbability of events around the Big Bang. Just take someone like Fred Hoyle years ago put it this way: a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. He was an atheist. Well, Paul Davies put it like porridge in the tale of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. The universe seems to be just right for life in so many intriguing ways. Richard Dawkins, the fact that life evolved out of nearly nothing is a fact so staggering that I would be mad to attempt words to do it justice. And even if that is not the end of the matter, not only did evolution happen, it eventually led to beings capable of comprehending the process, and even of comprehending the process by which they comprehended it. In other words, we can begin to understand how the brain worked. Einstein, the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. So the point I'm making is that even scientists who are not Christians regard it as an extraordinary and improbable universe that's very finely tuned. So my question is, okay, if, as applying Occam's razor, if I as a Christian believe in an imponderable mystery that I call God, who is responsible for all these other numerous incomprehensible and imponderable mysteries, such as fine-tuning in the Big Bang, origin of life, evolution, all of which I believe occurred through processes I can study as a scientist, but they're still very improbable. But there are a lot of imponderable mysteries instead of just one, if I believe that there is a God who, in a sense, injected a direction to the whole process. And so that puts Occam's razor down to me in favor of God. That is another argument. And then I come to the argument of, which is perhaps more contentious, but if I don't believe that there was ultimately a creator God, then I have to accept that I am purely the product of random processes that are driven purely by chance. Even in my brain, it's random collections of molecules banging together that make me the person that I am. Where is the, if you like, objective meaning in life, the purpose? Where do we get our morals from? Or are we just banging molecules banging around aimlessly? And I think I do feel that there is a meaning and purpose in life, and I do believe that that's God-given. And I suppose when I stand back, I find myself in agreement with C.S. Lewis, who had this wonderful quote: "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And I think my Christian faith provides an integrated and wonderfully satisfying worldview. It not only makes sense of the scientific endeavor, but provides a better intellectual framework for living and a sense also of hope for the future. So put all those things together, and it's not a proof for God, but it's persuaded me. The final thing in the pack is the resurrection of Jesus, who this man Jesus was. I, like many others, have been very convinced by not just the teaching of Jesus, which I think is quite remarkable, and I suspect many people who wouldn't call themselves Christians would agree. But the fact that it's claimed for him to be resurrected, to come back to life from the dead. Now, you can't do experiments to prove it, but those people who've looked into it have, or some, I'm sure not all, have found it very convincing. And I was particularly interested in reading Antony Flou's book, who was one of the most important atheist philosophers, humanist philosophers of the 20th century. And he, later in his life, changed his mind, and instead of believing there was no God, believed that there probably was a God. And in his book, There Is a God, it's a really interesting read, because he goes through all his old arguments as to why he used not to believe in God, and then he puts alongside them how he's now changed his mind. But right at the end of the book, there is a 30-page appendix by Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, who was Bishop of Durham and is now a professor in Aberdeen. And he looks at the evidence for the resurrection and why it is quite convincing. And I haven't got time to rehearse it, but I think that's something to me that people don't rise from the dead. So if Jesus did rise from the dead, that's very good evidence for God. I cannot prove it, but I think it can't be as dismissed as likely as some people would think. So there you go. There's 4 strands to my argument, and you can probably pick holes in all of them, Andrew. But that's what's convinced me to date.
Look, first of all, thank you for a very, very well stated case, and thank you for giving me the credit of being able to follow it. We'll see whether that was justified. That the biggest problem with your argument is maybe that you've given it to someone who is completely ill prepared. So I know that Matthew will have some things to say here too. So Matthew, if you would like to start, I will happily yield, and you just decide. I'll leave it to you. You tell me.
I'd like to just pick on one of the points and ask a how question on that point. And the point would be on God-given meaning in our lives. I'm a parent, so as any parent would know, our children give us immense purpose and immense pleasure. And part of becoming a parent is we completely change a lot of the priorities in our life, from mundane things like the choice of car that we have through to rearranging what our hobby priorities are. Excuse me. I no longer go on expensive weekends away with a car to drive it around a racetrack all weekend. For starters, it does cost an awful lot of money, and it's money I'd rather spend, and time I'd rather spend with my daughter. So we do an awful lot of readjusting or focus on that, but we still also do get meaning out of things that we do. Over the last couple of years, I've taken up podcasting, and I find it immensely motivating. I think one of the parts from the podcasting that I do is the meaning I get from having conversations, not unlike this one, with people who I would never have had a conversation with otherwise. It's given me a bravery to ask people who are much more well known than I am, and to ask them directly, can I have a conversation with you, and can I record it, and then can I put it on the internet? And I've had some no's, but I've had far more yeses than I've had no's, and they've all been lovely conversations. And I find them all tremendously motivating. So I would say that they give me meaning. So what I'm building up to is all of those things that I've said are what I would call subjective or personal meaning, in that they're things that motivate me because I enjoy them, and I do them because I enjoy them, and because I enjoy them, I'm motivated to do them. And sometimes part of that motivation is the pleasure of others. If you were to ask me what the most wonderful sound in the world is, my answer without hesitation is the sound of my daughter laughing. And I can't enjoy that if I'm not with her, and I can't enjoy that if I'm telling her a dad joke. So all those kinds of things. So I guess the question that I'm leading up to is, how would I be able to tell if any of the things that motivate me and give me meaning are things that have been placed on me objectively by a God, as opposed to something that I choose to do myself?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that whatever way you look at it, something is going on in your brain that there is a scientific explanation for, that is producing pleasure, is causing you to respond in a particular way. And of course, at one level, all animal life has certain characteristics which are probably instinctive, but animals care for their young, they play with their young. Certainly the higher animals do. So there is something inbuilt in the way we are, which has a biological explanation. But I think I want to step behind that and say that I think that it's very difficult to prove this, but I think most biologists, probably, certainly anthropologists, would say that there is something unique about our ability as human beings to think outside of ourselves, almost to step outside of ourselves and analyze what we're doing, to even ask the question, why do I enjoy this? When it comes to a whole load of decisions that we make, be they ethical decisions and so on, we're standing back and we're asking questions. And I suppose I want to know, where is that something that is just got a biological process that can be purely explained by evolution? Or could it be that there is a God-given direction to these processes that God has wired in there? And that part of the distinctive nature of being human, which of course the Bible talks of as being made in the image of God, is this distinctive ability to make moral judgments, not just to act instinctively, to have pleasure that you actually stand back and look and think, isn't that wonderful? And I wonder what she's going to turn into, and all these sort of things. I would say that is more than just random biological processes. That's part of that God-given being made in the image of God. God himself, if you accept the biblical view, is a God of relationships. And that is something that I think is very, very key in talking about family life, our friends and so on. There's something very special, which I do believe is God-given. But of course I can't prove it, and there are alternative explanations.
Yes, thank you for that. And yes, I certainly agree that the mechanics behind why I would take so much pleasure from my daughter's laugh and not another teenager's laugh. There's a complexity there which is difficult to explain. We can probably hazard a guess, and some people might be able to get closer to the truth than I could. I think where I would go to from there is let's take, for example, that I'm convinced that is an objective meaning that's given to me by a higher power. I think where I go from there is, where do I demarcate the difference? I wouldn't attribute my taste in music and my taste in films or even my taste in car to a higher power, but I do attribute my taste in what I take pleasure with from those that I love. But ultimately, in terms of the technicality that's going on in my brain, aren't the two effectively the same? So
Yes,
if they're effectively the same, why would I say one's from God and one's different when...
I wouldn't. I would say they're both from God.
Okay.
I wouldn't make the distinction at all. I mean, one of the things that I really am very much against is this whole concept of separating the scientific explanation from the faith explanation. To me, that gets close to the God of the gaps, and just because I don't understand how something works, I introduce God. Well, that's crazy, because God has a mechanism of how he is working through mechanisms, and ultimately we may be able to understand almost everything, but it doesn't deny that God's doing it. So when you say, okay, why should I enjoy a particular sort of music? Well, I think that's what one could explain that probably in terms of a biological wiring of your brain. But that doesn't mean that God is not behind that. And what makes you, you, and what makes me, me, the whole question of personality is a very, very difficult question to answer, because some people would say that we are purely the product of our physical brain. But isn't there something more about you than just the physical brain? I mean, what is the soul, the spirit, the person that makes you you? What happens to a person who has a brain injury or dementia? The expression of the personhood is gone because the machinery won't allow it to express itself. But I still believe that the real person is there. If you like, the program could be rerun on another computer and the person would re-emerge, because they are there and they're using the hardware of the brain to express that personality. And as the hardware develops as we develop, so the ability of the software to express itself in ever more sophisticated ways develop. And just as computers learn to communicate with each other and cooperate with each other, it's a process that is, the programs are learning to interact with each other, but they wouldn't be there at all if it weren't for the creator.
Yes,
I don't know if I'm making any sense at all.
It does make sense. I get the analogy. As a software developer myself, I understand the analogy. But I think I'd like to still rewind and go back to what we find meaning and stuff. Because if I accept that the things that I like, the things I find meaning in, are mostly arbitrary, accidents of biology, for lack of a better phrase, the food that I like, the films that I like, the music that I like, the colors that I like, or all those kinds of things. They're as arbitrary as the things that I'm good at. I'm a terrible singer. I'm a little bit of a better runner, but I'm certainly not a long distance runner. So I accept those physical attributes are a quirk of biology just as much as the mental attributes are. And I think the challenge that I would give is, if there's a God behind all of this, and he's giving purpose, certainly at this point, and it's certainly more important in the last 12 months, is we're a family of three. We spend most of the days within the walls of our house. More often than I would like, we're in separate rooms. Sometimes it's practical purposes because I'm here in my own room podcasting right now. But there are also times when I would dearly love to sit on the sofa with my wife and daughter for an evening and watch a movie together. The trouble is, and it's been the bane of this family life for as long as I can remember, we don't have the same taste in movie entertainment. You know, my daughter would rather watch Harry Potter for the umpteenth time. I'd rather watch a superhero movie, and my wife has another choice altogether. And way too often, and more often than I care to admit, we end up bailing and not watching something together because we just can't agree. And it will be utterly wonderful if the God of the universe would just see it fit that we actually had tastes in music, in movies rather, that overlapped a little bit more than they are. Yeah, I don't mind disagreeing with Andrew on our technology choices because he's wrong and we get mileage out of it on our podcast every now and then. But that same relationship doesn't work with those I love at home. You know, I want more overlap in the things that we like on our Gogglebox.
I mean, there's several ways of looking at that. I mean, first of all, of course, we choose our life partners, and to some extent, we don't always know all their quirks and foibles before we marry them. But there is a bit of vive la différence. So I remember years ago when I was before I was married, and I had a girlfriend who I once said to my present wife, I think she might have got 10 out of 10, but I could never have lived with her. And there's so many levels to relationships, and there's some give and take, but that's what, to some extent, makes the world so exciting. And I guess the other way of looking at it is, well, can you find something that you all do like and do together? But we don't want to get on to counseling here. But I think the thing that I find perhaps is relevant here is that there is an extraordinary openness in the way the world is. I mean, we just talked about things like the Big Bang and evolution and randomness, and the whole way that the world is, it is quite almost chaotic at one level, and yet out of that chaos comes something very wonderful. And in the process of evolution, it's a chaotic process at one level, but through natural selection and things, you get some extraordinary and beautiful things. But of course, you also get some horrendous things. But if you didn't have that extraordinary openness, you'd have a very bland universe. It would be a cotton wool universe. We wouldn't have any free will. We'd be automatons. So that, you know, where would be the fun? If you had no sparks in the relationship, if you were always agreeing with each other, it wouldn't be any fun at all. There is a creative tension in difference. So to some extent, I think that it's a bit like saying, could you have done anything better yourself? Which is what Job was asked by God. You know, okay, you're about here to criticize it, but could you have done any better and still created a wonderful universe? I don't think I'd like to have had a go.
I think there's a syllogism here that I don't remember where I first heard it. Probably a fellow over on the Unbelievable boards goes by the pseudonym Val. It goes directly to the heart of not whether I could do better, but whether a God should have done better. So it questions the state of this universe in the light of a God who wants us all to go to heaven. The syllogism is somewhat this way. If there's an all-powerful God, then that all-powerful God could have, it would seem, create free will beings who simply choose not to sin. And if he can create free will beings that choose not to sin, then this universe seems to contradict that very idea. I find this idea quite compelling, not quite put in syllogistic form, I recognize, but it can be. It's trivial. I think it's quite a powerful idea because there is the idea of angels who have free will and who, in the war in heaven, chose to stay on the side of God through nothing but their free will. Obviously, it's true that there are some angels who are fallen if you accept the story. But given the story its very best hearing, it seems to be self-contradictory that a God had to give us free will to sin when the story necessarily includes those beings who have free will that don't. And so do I think I could do better? I don't know. I don't have universe creating tools. But the story itself seems to imply that those beings exist and have free will.
I think where I find that slightly difficult is that could you create a being that has free will and always chooses what is right? Because to some extent you're constraining them to do that. If you're the creator, you must be giving them the power to always choose what is right, and therefore you aren't really giving them free will. So I'm not sure whether I follow that argument. I'm not going to get into the argument of angels falling or not falling in heaven, because I'm not sure I understand that. What I do understand is that I, here and now, have the opportunity to choose between good and evil, and sadly I make the wrong choice rather more often than I care to admit. But I'd far rather have that choice than to be forced to do the same thing. To always choose what is good, I don't think would be actually a real choice. I mean, I can imagine, if you have a child that is always doing exactly what you tell him to, or if you, I wonder if you think there's something slightly wrong with this child. They haven't got any character.
I think that's not actually an answer to the argument. The argument doesn't propose that God is making them do anything. It only says that God selects for creation those who, in His capacity from everlasting to everlasting, did actually only not sin. So they're not being constrained in the sense that He is forcing them. They are choosing not to sin, and He just happens to pick those who, in His capacity as an all-knowing, all-powerful being, has the ability to select those for creation that make those choices that are not counter to His will. So it's not a constraint, I think, in the sense that I understood you, though feel free to push back.
Yeah, I still think that, you're saying He only chose those individuals who would choose His way. That does sound a bit like forcing the hand. But the other thing I would say is that one of the great joys of any, you could have it in art, you can have it in moral behavior, that light and dark do enhance each other. And to some extent, we know the wonder of love because we also see the horrendous consequences of where love is not shown. And I just wonder actually how easy it would be if everybody always made the right choice, whether we'd really have a world that produced so much richness. You know how it is when you've had a really tough time and then something really good happens, it makes the good feel even better. So I do think actually having this real choice and sometimes people failing does produce a richer world. But of course, I'm not God, and you may be right. Maybe He could have done it another way, but it does make sense to me.
I will offer one more rejoinder, just because I'm enjoying the conversation. This particular part. It seems to me that the necessary defeater to what you've said there is that there are beings, if we accept any part of that orthodoxy, they don't have the best life they could live because by following the will of God, they don't get the richness that we who don't get. And that seems to me to be quite internally inconsistent, though you may have a different perspective. That's my last rejoinder. And I'll leave it there, but I did enjoy it. This interchange.
I see what you're saying now, and I think the truth is that if we all did the will of God perfectly, we would have the best possible life. The reality is that we don't, and the question then becomes, if everybody automatically did do the will of God out of free choice, would it have been a world that made any sense? And it's certainly not where we're at. And so I tend to assume that God, in a sense, knew that if you give a being free will, if it's truly free, some people will choose to go the other way. And so although, yes, it would be better if everybody lived according to the will of God, in reality, they won't. And yet the world is still a remarkable place. And the good is made even more good by seeing the bad. But we could go on all day, but I take your point.
Yeah, no, I won't rejoin because I understand your response too. I know that some people are quite convinced by fine-tuning. Douglas Adams, I don't know if you've read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
I know that
you prefer. Oh, you have read it. Okay. So,
no, I haven't read it, but I know of it. I haven't actually read it. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, my apologies. Douglas Adams talked about water in a mud puddle. He sort of has the water questioning how perfect the shape of the ground is, that it must have been fine-tuned just for this puddle of water, so there's a little bit of anthropomorphism going on here. But without that sort of, I think the answer, I think the example's like a little trite, but it seems to me that fine-tuning does have this kind of problem in the sense that at the moment we are almost in our infancy, understanding the fine constants of the universe and how they're assembled to influence each other. When we talk about fine-tuning and we're sort of in awe of these oh gosh numbers, I'm not sure that it is time to make a proclamation that the universe is fine-tuned. Except that you may know much more about this than I do. But I don't even think we can read the controls of the universe yet. We don't know why the dials, it seems to me, are set to the values they are. And so it seems to me that without that sort of behind-the-scenes knowledge, it is a bit premature to declare that because these constants are the way they are and because we do occur within them, none of which I dispute, it seems to me that it's a little premature to call it fine-tuned. And I just wonder what your response to that is.
Well, I think the first thing, actually, you used a very interesting expression, why they're set to the values they are, which suggested somebody was doing the setting, but I'll take that as a
well, it was done on purpose, actually.
Yeah.
But it was just to give the idea that these constants have a range, not that someone set them, if you see what I mean.
Well, I'm not a cosmologist, so I can't give you a sort of well-informed response. But what I do know is that most of these constants have to be balanced. Yeah, they have to be within 1 part in 10 to the 60 or something to give the stable universe we have. So that the sense of it being fine-tuned, what it's saying is that the degree of tolerance in the figures that we have is incredibly, incredibly fine. Now, of course, it must be like that, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And the question is really, did somebody, as you used the term, set it in the first place so it would happen, or did it just emerge? And because it emerged and produced the result, we're here to witness that it did. And as I say, I both are logically quite feasible, acceptable, but I just feel with all the other arguments that I do find that the God hypothesis is a better one. But I then have to admit that I have no idea where God came from. So I am left with this mystery. But then my science is telling me more and more that we live in a very mysterious universe. So I'm not so worried about the God mystery. Because I think whether you're a believer or not, there are mysteries out there, the mystery of the Big Bang, the mystery of quantum theory and multi-dimensions, string theory, all of these things, to me, are mysteries. I can't get my mind around it. So I just find the God mystery a more convincing one than all the others. but it's at the end of the day, there is faith. There is faith. And where does that come from? And why should you have, in a sense, moved away from a faith position? And I have maintained mine, and I've seen others come to a faith position. And one thing that I've wondered about, and I don't know, you might want to, both of you, comment on this, is that I fear that one of the reasons that people have moved away from a faith position is because they've been taught to believe in 10 impossible things before breakfast, like you've got to believe in a 6-day creation. You've got to believe that God's a conjurer who always answers prayer just as we want him to. Things which I don't believe Scripture teaches and I don't believe are right. But if you've been brought up to believe that, and then you suddenly realize this doesn't really make sense, and this doesn't certainly fit with scientific understanding, and then you throw the baby out with the bathwater and you've lost trust in the whole faith perspective. And I don't know, but I've seen too many people go down that route to think, well, if only we got it right earlier and we got the churches to understand science and faith so they didn't try and force their believers to believe the unbelievable. So I don't know.
That's an interesting question. Certainly for my own story, for the relevance here, I was brought up in a missionary environment in Zambia in the 70s, 80s, and I was very much indoctrinated into a literal young earth creationist view. So for me, the Bible was all true, every word of it. And yes, that did create very, very real and very, very genuine difficulties for me when as an adult, I then gained a better understanding of evolution. And I've seen a lot of people who've had a similar background go a similar route to me. So the obvious question is, if Christianity abolished creationism and I had a more nuanced understanding of Christianity, my education in that missionary environment, would I still be a Christian now? I honestly am not in a position to be able to answer that question. I acknowledge that it's a possibility, but I genuinely can't put a number onto what that possibility could be. But what I will say is, during my deconstruction, some of the more nuanced questions there about what the Old Testament, certainly the beginning of the Old Testament means, and the questions about what can we accept, and then the questions about what does the resurrection of Jesus mean, and what does the revelation of the apostles and even modern day Christians mean, and things like that. And like we've already discussed as well, the question of objective meaning and morality, and will I cease to be a good person if I stop being a Christian? All of those things did come around as well, and that was why it took me I report that it took about 3 years, the full transition. And so I did I did struggle my way through all of those issues and all of those difficulties. And eventually I concluded that I just couldn't believe anymore, because I didn't know what I could believe. And I think that's what the problem was. And it certainly was the creationism dilemma that got me walking down that road. I obviously can't tell you how life would have been different if I'd had a different journey. But what I can say is, Andrew and I have had the pleasure of speaking to a variety of atheists who we've met through other atheist podcasts and blogs and people. And yes, there are an awful lot of former fundamentalists and former biblical inerrantists out there who are now atheists. But there are also people who are atheists who come from much softer Christianity. I don't know what the right phrase to use is there. People who never got young earth creationists, who never understood why young Earth creation was even a thing, but they still walked away as well.
Mm. Mm.
So I don't know how to answer that point.
No, I mean, I'm not. It's not a sort of one way or the other answer. I'm just saying I think that it has had a profound effect, and it almost going full circle to talking about Christians in science. One of the reasons that I particularly was keen to work with students and early career scientists is to at least enable them to see that there were many extremely prestigious scientists who had a very, very strong scientific pedigree, who were able to hold together their faith and their science and modern understanding of the world. And that, you know, if I can help people at least not to lose faith unnecessarily, then I've done something. But I have friends who have had what the sort of soft, if you could call it, upbringing, and a lot of them have never really bothered to think and can't be bothered to think. That saddens me. I mean, you're both still thinking and questioning, which is great. But you know, one of the things that worries me is a lot of people just can't be bothered to even ask the question. To them, they've almost made up their mind without looking at the evidence, and that does sadden me. You can't argue anybody into faith. There is, you can provide the evidence, you can encourage, but at the end of the day, there is a personal decision to be made, and why some people are able to take that step and others not, I don't know. I don't know if you've heard, there's a lovely story about the tightrope walker Blondin. He was a French guy, and he was the world famous, probably the best ever, I think, tightrope walker. And one of his tricks was to put a tightrope wire all the way across the gorge of Niagara Falls. And the huge numbers of people would come and watch him walk across the tightrope on his with his bar, you know, the tightrope, all those tightrope people hold. But he'd also walk across pushing somebody in a wheelbarrow. And the journalists and so on were staggered by this. And when he got to the other side, he said, "Do you believe that I can walk across Niagara Falls?" They said, "Well, of course we do. We've seen you do it. We've seen the evidence. Yes, you can." So his next question was, who's next in the wheelbarrow to come back? And there's a big difference between believing something and then actually believing it to the extent that you trust in it. And where does that trust come from? And there is a mystery there. But one of the things that I learned from C.S. Lewis is how he said, well, I thought through all of the evidence, and eventually I decided the evidence for God was better than the evidence against. I still had a lot of questions. So I did take the leap of faith. I got on into the wheelbarrow, if you like. And then I continued my journey, still asking the questions. And I found that more and more of them, I was satisfied with the answers. And I'm still asking a lot of questions. I still don't have all the answers. I still have doubts and areas that I find very difficult. But overall, I find my belief in God is greater than it was. As somebody once said, the older I get, the more and more certain I get about less and less. So the fundamentals I'm more and more certain about. There are things around the edges I really am less certain about. But the fundamental core belief is as strong, if not stronger than ever. Anyway, I've rambled on a bit there.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I'm familiar with the wheelbarrow analogy. I would be one of those people saying, yeah, somebody else can ride in the wheelbarrow. It's not for me. Thank you very much. Andrew, are there any other questions you wanted to throw out?
I don't think so, because in the end, I think where we got to is a matter of agreement that we can have reasonable people on both sides of this discussion. I think we could do the discussion a certain amount of disservice if we continue to offer example and counterexample, because I think this discussion is better as a testament to the fact that this kind of conversation can be had between gentlemen, the two of you, and at least one hanger-on, me. So I won't claim being a gentleman. Andrew, I do want to say again, thank you for the work that you do. I hope that in the end, in your work as you continue, you don't receive the kind of negative pushback from the humanist society that is sometimes reported. Both sides can be ill-behaved, and I hope that you don't get splashed with any of that at all. I want to say, even if we don't wrap now, I want to say thank you for being willing to come on to this show with two skeptics with very little, very little advance about how it might go. So thank you for being willing to talk to us wherever we go in the conversation from here.
No, it's a pleasure. I should think we probably ought to wrap it up. I'll just say one thing that you've mentioned about the feedback from the humanists or atheists. Who knows what my colleagues say behind my back? But I think to some extent, if you are a good scientist and you are an ethical and considerate person, people will say, by and large, they'll say, well, I don't believe what you're talking about, but I respect you as a person. Sadly, there are people who, in the sciences, who don't have that rather more mature attitude. And I feel very much for some Christians who find themselves in a church that doesn't really support them as a scientist, and in a workplace that is really quite antagonistic. And that's another reason for Christians in Science, because we want to provide a place, a safe space, if you like, where people who are struggling with certain aspects of their Christian faith and some of the reactions they're getting from their scientific colleagues, they are amongst friends, and there is the opportunity to provide support and encouragement for one another.
Yeah,
Matthew,
I'll echo that. Let's be friends, I think. Sorry, Andrew?
Oh, I was just going to ask if you had questions.
I've just got one. I hope it won't be too tough of a question before we go for our bonus final question. I'm going to guess, Andrew, that you remember the what was his name? The Bishop of Durham, when he made headlines in the was it in the early 90s?
The conjuring trick with bones.
Yes, that's right. And he said that the resurrection of Jesus wasn't a literal one. His resurrection is a metaphorical one because he lives in our hearts. And I remember being in my 20s and at a church and that. And I remember the next house group after that made the papers was quite an interesting house group, because the minister of the Presbyterian church Methodist church that I was going to at the time affirmed the Bishop of Durham's comments. And I was devastated. I didn't know what to do, because I always had assumed that, and up until until later in life anyway, that the resurrection was a literal event that actually happened. And there were several others in the little house group, and it was quite a strange meeting. And I think a few people left a bit broken-hearted. They weren't expecting their minister to affirm those comments. And I think it left a few people wondering what to do with their faith. So I just wondered if would that be a kind of Christianity that you would be able to adhere to, or is the resurrection of far greater importance for you?
David Jenkins was the Bishop of Bristol.
That's right, David Jenkins. I knew the name. Yeah. I just couldn't dig it out.
And actually, in some ways, he did more service to the Christian faith than he realized, because it was such a talking point that a lot of people were talking about Christianity that never would. I think there's two sides to that. First of all, I do believe fundamentally that Christ was physically risen from the dead. I am not one who looks for miracles around every corner, but I do think that was a fundamental time when God intervened, for a very good reason, in that, in a sense, as I said in my reasons for belief, I believe that the evidence for the resurrection is very good, and we haven't got time to dwell on it too much, but it is something that people do not rise from the dead, and the very fact that he did, in my view, rise physically from the dead and was seen albeit in a slightly unusual form that seemed to be able to appear and disappear, but nevertheless in a physical form that could eat. The witness of those who saw him, I find convincing, and it helps convince me of the truth of my faith. So in that sense, I would disagree with David Jenkins. But where I would agree with him is that the significance of the resurrection is a spiritual one. And it is the new life that we have spiritually that is critical for us. And therefore, to focus on the bones, if you like, and what happened to them is not the important thing. It is to focus on the fact that in his death and resurrection, God has brought about a new beginning in terms of our spiritual lives and our ability to work with him in bringing about his kingdom here on earth, which will reach its fulfillment, I believe, at some time in the future when Christ returns. But it is very much, the emphasis for us is not on the bones, but is on the new life, which we can experience. So, yes, I think it's important we uphold the traditional Christian view of a bodily resurrection, one of the main tenets of the creed. But no, don't make that the focus of your understanding of the resurrection. Look beyond that to what it means spiritually.
I think that's a very considered answer, Andrew, and I think I would agree with you that the physical resurrection is important for Christianity. I obviously was exposed to that as an idea when I wasn't expecting it, and thought about it for a long time, and then forgot about it, and then thought about it again when I was exiting. And I think having permission to doubt the physical resurrection of Jesus is permission to doubt the existence of God, and is certainly an easy way out of Christianity altogether. So I think it is important to Christianity for the reasons that you said. And like I say, it's not a subject that we've got the time for, but we've had a really lovely conversation anyway. The final question then, Andrew, and thank you for the time that you've given us, is do you have a favourite Bible character, and who are they?
Yeah, you warned me you might ask me that, and as I think I may have said to you, it's a bit like asking which of my children do I love the best, and of course the answer is you can't.
Stick with one. That's the answer to that one.
Yeah, having one child, but never say you prefer one child to the other. But you would prefer a certain child to be with you in a particular circumstance than one of your other children. So it's circumstance dependent. And in the context of our discussion tonight, then my favourite biblical character has to be Thomas, of course, because Thomas doubted. He looked for evidence. But when he saw it, he said, "My Lord and my God," and was convinced. And the reason I like that is that I don't think there's anything wrong on asking questions, questioning even the very existence of God. And of course, what was Thomas doing? He was questioning the resurrection. But when he saw the evidence, he responded accordingly. And I think it's right to ask questions, look at the evidence. And I hope and pray that people who do that will see in that evidence that God exists, and that maybe through Jesus they can get to know him and have a much better life than without him. You may not at the moment feel that, but that's where I come from.
Thank you. What a great answer given the conversation that we had.
Other than the one website that you gave up at the front, Christians, is it cis.org.uk? Did I get that right?
Yep.
.org.uk.
It will be in the show notes.
Is there any other place for our listeners to reach out to you? Do you like that kind of contact? And do you have any other places that books that you're involved in, articles that you think people should read?
The best thing is
a Facebook page.
Yeah, there is. But the best thing is to go onto the website. There are lots of links there. The sort of other organisations are really interesting. Biologos in the States, which was set up originally by Francis Collins, who headed up the Human Genome Project and is now head of the National Institute of Health in the States. Brilliant guy. He set that up, and That takes a very conservative view of Scripture, but a very conservative, a very standard scientific view of evolution and so on. There's a lot of good stuff there. The Faraday Institute in Cambridge, but they're all linked on our website.
Okay, good.
Excellent. Thank you once again, Andrew. It's been a wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed it. For listeners, please do remember you've just heard what Andrew's favourite Bible character is. What we're trying to do is we're trying to encourage our listeners to tell us what their favourite Bible character is. So please check into the show notes. There'll be a link to our Anchor page where you can drop us a voicemail and tell us a little bit about who you are, who your favourite Bible character is. And if we get enough of our responses, because I'm sure we've got enough listeners that we can have several responses, and we'll put those into an episode hopefully later in the year, but we'll see how long it takes us to get enough responses. So that's the thing to do. Don't leave it to just the guests to tell us who their favourite Bible characters are. I'm sure, dear listeners, you've got one as well. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining with me this evening. And until next time, good night. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.